We've just experienced the 82nd anniversary of D-Day. I'd like to talk about the incredible operation called Operation Overlord, which took place on D-Day, the 6th of June 1944. The scale of the operation is absolutely mind-boggling, and it is perhaps most probably the most important day of the 26,500 days of the 20th century. D-Day is the most important one because due to the events on D-Day, the Nazis were defeated. Imagine that didn't happen. Imagine there wasn't a D-Day and there wasn't a second front opened up against the Nazis. So the Nazis may just have won the war. And we shudder to imagine what the world would look like. Many more hundreds of thousands, millions of people and of Jews would have been murdered if the Nazis weren't defeated. The two observations I'd like to make at the outset before we get to the actual scale and complexity and drama of the operation is, firstly, we learn most importantly from D-Day and from the Second World War that when there are megalomaniacs, when there are totalitarian states and crazy dictators, we need to stand up to them before they can consolidate their power and build their strength. If Chamberlain would have stopped Hitler in the late 1930s, so we wouldn't have had the Second World War, and we wouldn't have had 65 million people killed, 6 million Jews. None of that would have happened. If the monster was stopped in his tracks early on, so it would have prevented all of the carnage, all of the havoc, all of the human suffering and bloodshed. That's a very, very important lesson in history that we should always remember, because if we don't, we'll be doomed to repeat it. Of course, nobody wants war. Of course, nobody wants to send our youth, our beautiful young men, into battle and into harm's way and to face possible death. No rational, normal person would want that to be. Of course not. But when we have these crazy dictators that want to dominate the globe and want to carry out their nefarious plans, we have no choice but to stand up to them. And if we don't, and the longer we kick the can down the road, the more difficult it will be to stop them, and the more suffering and the bigger the effort it will take to stop them. And that's a great lesson we learn. And certainly, if the Nazis were 6 months away from developing their own nuclear bomb, wow, imagine such a thing, the Nazis with nuclear weapons. And therefore, the parallels to today, we're in 2026, we're in the middle of the war with Iran. And Iran has to be stopped also, because if they develop nuclear weapons, they will hold the world hostage. And not only Israel and the Middle East, but the entire world will be in peril, because these crazy Shiite clerics will have tremendous power. They have an apocalyptic view of the world, and things would be very, very dangerous for all of humanity and all of the free world. And so one needs to stop them early. One needs to stop the nutcases quickly, and that actually saves lives. Very important historical lesson. And lesson number 2 is Hakara Satov, is to have a basic sense of appreciation to those that were involved in these actions, and for those that stopped the evil. So we have to have a Hakara Satov to the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen involved in D-Day. We have to have a Hakara Satov to the generals that made the plans and executed them. We have to have a Hakara Satov to the leaders like Churchill and like Roosevelt, who made sure that Hitler was stopped and that the 1,000-year Reich was brought to an end. And likewise today, we need to have a Hakara Satov and appreciation to President Trump and to the sailors and to the airmen and to the soldiers of the United States military. And we have to have appreciation to Prime Minister Netanyahu and the brave soldiers of Tzahal who are putting their lives on the line every day to protect the Jewish people. And so the least we can do is have appreciation for their tremendous self-sacrifice in destroying the evil that is a real peril for all of the free world. Because Chamberlain did not stop Hitler early on, when Hitler was probing and he was seeing whether, as he carried out his aggressive plans and strategies, he was waiting for a reaction from the democracies. And he saw that there was very little reaction. And he realized, he took Austria to the Sudetenland, he then went into Poland. In fact, historians say he was quite surprised when Britain and France actually stood up to their commitment to protect Poland and declared war on Germany on the 1st of September 1939. But by that time, Hitler had already built up his forces. He built the most formidable army the world has ever seen, and he resupplied that army. The German armament industry was in full flow by that time, and he was much, much more difficult to stop. And so because Hitler was given time and space to build up his forces and build up his army, we needed a operation like D-Day, the scale that it was. I mean, D-Day, there were 6,000 ships, 12,000 planes, 3 million troops were involved, 150,000 landed on the day of D-Day. There were 23,000 paratroopers that landed behind enemy lines. Can you imagine the size, the largest armada that the world has ever seen? That was required to stop Hitler in 1944 because the Germans were so powerful and so formidable as a fighting force. So let's look at the scale of the operation, and let's dig deep into a little bit of the planning and a little bit of what was necessary in order for this to be a success. The Allies, Britain and United States, promised Stalin, who was their ally now because Hitler attacked Russia, they promised Stalin that there would be a Western Front opened in early 1944. In fact, they met, the three Allied leaders met in November 1943, in all places one would least expect, in Tehran. It was called the Tehran Conference. Isn't that ironic? Because we have the war with Iran today. And at that meeting, they committed to early 44 to open up the Western Front. Stalin was struggling, and of course the war with the Germans in Russia was raging. And Stalin knew that if a Western Front was opened, it would give his troops relief and give them the opportunity to defend themselves and ultimately to overrun the Nazis. But without a Western Front, it probably would not have happened. And so he was pushing for it, and they agreed. And so what did they need to do now, the Allies, Churchill and Roosevelt? They had to appoint a supreme leader of this operation. Now, the head of the Allied armies in the European theater was General Bernard Montgomery. The head of the Allied Air Force was Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, and the head of the Allied Navy in the European theater was Admiral Bertram Ramsay. All three of those were British, and since the Americans were so involved, so the Americans would make sense that the overall commander would be an American. So this individual had to be found. First, they wanted George Marshall, who was the chief of staff, the head of the United States Army. But Roosevelt said he was indispensable, and he couldn't do without him in the States. The leader of this operation would have to go to Europe, would have to plan it, would have to oversee it. And Roosevelt said he needed Marshall by his side to run the military from America. And so they had to find somebody else. And one of the rising stars in the American general staff was Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a brilliant organizer. He was a very powerful leader. He was able to get on with people and to put together a team of effective generals successfully. He was very good with people. He had a great sense of humor, and he was certainly the man for the job. He had a short temper, a short fuse, and so if you didn't live up to his high standards, he certainly would let you know. Eisenhower had been the one who oversaw the landings in North Africa and in Italy, and so he had the experience to plan the operation, and so he was selected. They approached Marshall, and Roosevelt asked him to take up this daunting task of being the supreme commander of the Allied invasion on the Western Front, and he agreed, but he said with one condition, and that condition was that his say would be final, because he knew that there would be so many thousands of variables and so many nuances, and if nobody could take responsibility and make the final decision, it wouldn't get done properly. And so he was wise enough to understand that, and he made that commitment. He required, that was the condition, and they made that commitment to him, that they said, fine, you will be the one who makes the ultimate decisions. They then sent him to England, and he met with Churchill, and he said the same thing to Churchill. I will take this task on as long as I have the final say, and Churchill too agreed. Eisenhower arrives early 1944 in England. His headquarters were in Portsmouth, and he now had to plan the operation. They had the British Army had drawn up some plans, but both Eisenhower and Montgomery felt that the scale was too small. They wanted to use 3 divisions, and they knew that you needed 5 divisions in order for it to succeed. And so the planning began. Now the big question was, where would they attack? We know the Germans built formidable defenses on their western border. Now remember, Germany at this time, as we mentioned earlier, where they were left, so Hitler had the chance to build up his forces, to consolidate himself, and to take all of Europe. What is the EU today was under German control. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Poland, large parts of Soviet Union, they were all controlled by this massive Nazi empire. And on that western border of this massive European Nazi empire, they built formidable defenses all the way from Spain in the south to Norway in the north. It was 2,687 kilometers, that western border of Europe. And that was very well defended by the Germans. They had they appointed Erwin Rommel, who was one of their top generals, to come and inspect and improve the defenses on what they called the Atlantic Wall. And Rommel arrived at the end of 1943, and he was very unhappy with what had been done, and he felt that it was completely below what it should be. And he got the German army into action and the German engineering corps, and by the end, there were 13 million tons of concrete poured, largely after Rommel's involvement, 1.4 million tons of steel. There were a huge amount of massive artillery guns facing the sea. There were huge bunkers and machine gun nests. The whole coastline was extremely well defended, certainly after Rommel got involved. And in low tide, they planted all of these traps for the boats to come in. You know, they were those like X-shaped things, and they had mines. Most of them were mined on the end, so if a ship touched them, they would explode. If they weren't mined, it would puncture the ship. So the ships would have to land in low tide, and that would give a large area in front of the beaches for the artillery and the machine gun nests to mow down any movement of an attacking force. And so the defenses were formidable. Now, imagine what's going on in Eisenhower's head. So he knows that he wants to land there would be an amphibious invasion of a massive army. That means a tremendous amount of ships with soldiers and places to unload the supplies, because an army's success depends on its weaponry, depends on its reinforcements, depends on its food. So you need a huge infrastructure to support an army that's landing in France, in Western Europe. And so the ideal place, of course, would be a deep water port, a normal port, one of the large ports of Western Europe or Western France. The Allies tried to see whether they would be able to take a deep water port, and they sent in some of their best special forces commandos in a place called Dieppe in 1942. There were British commandos, there were Canadian commandos, and they got completely obliterated in Dieppe by the German defenses, because the German defenses were so well positioned and so well worked out that they just mowed down anybody who approached, and it was an abject failure. And so this gave the Allied generals pause that to take a deep water port would be extremely difficult, because every single port was very well defended. But Eisenhower, I saw on YouTube an interview with Eisenhower by Walter Cronkite in 1964, which is 20 years later. Cronkite, together with Eisenhower, went back to Normandy, went back to the beaches, and interviewed him. It's just the most fascinating interview, because it is one of my hobbies and obsessions, D-Day. I find it very, very fascinating. I've read a lot of books about it. But to hear the interview of Eisenhower is just incredible, because you're hearing from the man himself and what the different challenges were and what the different decisions were that he made. He said when he arrived in England, the English engineers came to him and they said, we've devised something called a mobile harbor, in which what we do is we will sink old battleships, which will be the breakwaters, and then we construct large blocks of concrete that we will tow across the channel, and they have air in them, so they'll float. And then when we arrive where we want to position them, we fill them with water, and they will be the keys upon which the ships will dock and unload. And therefore it means that you could also stage your invasion on beaches. And we will bring these mobile harbors, they called them Mulberry Harbors, that was their code name, and we would be able to do that for you. So Eisenhower said that was a game changer. It was a complete breakthrough, because now they didn't have to take a deep water port, but they could look at different beaches upon which they could stage the landings, in which, although everything was fortified, that whole coastline of 2,800 kilometers, 687 kilometers was fortified, but the beaches were less well protected than the deep water harbors. So Eisenhower then said we could then look at the beaches, which was tremendous. They then had to decide where it would be. Now, what was critical, what the success and failure of the D-Day landings depended on, was the ability to deceive the Germans, because there were 2 panzer divisions. So most of the bunkers and the fortifications were manned by second-grade troops, older troops, some foreign troops of foreign countries that the Nazis had brought in to fight for them, but they weren't the top soldiers. The top soldiers were the crack panzer divisions, which were probably the best soldiers in the world, although the Americans would say their paratroopers were the best in the world. And they had battle experience, and they were extremely efficient and extremely capable on the battlefield. Now, if those panzer divisions would get to the invasion early, they would certainly push the invading forces back into the sea. And Rommel knew that, and he had a big dispute with von Rundstedt, who was the head of German forces in France. Rommel was the head of the defenses on the Atlantic Wall. And Rommel wanted the panzers very near the possible points where he thought the invasion would take place. Von Rundstedt said we need the panzers in the bases in the cities, and we'll deploy them once the beginning of the invasion starts. But Rommel knew that if they didn't get there quickly, and the Allies would be successful in creating bridgeheads, so then it would be impossible it would be very difficult to defeat them. So Rommel knew the success of the landings depended on the first 24 hours, and really the outcome on the war would be contingent on making sufficient, being able to create sufficient beachheads in those early hours of the war. So they kind of came up with a compromise. Rommel and Van Rundstedt and the Panzers were not right by the coast, but they were in strategic positions. Now, Eisenhower knew this too. In other words, that was very clear and obvious to all the generals, is that those first few hours were vital and critical. So Eisenhower wanted to bomb all the transportation lines in France, and this would prevent the crack troops from getting to the place of the invasion. And so he went to the heads of the Air Force, and he said, I need you to bomb the railway lines and the railway centers and the bridges in France in order that would stop the reinforcements from arriving. Now, there was a big dispute because the heads of the Allied air forces said the way we will defeat Germany is by bombing Germany. We need to bomb the industrial zone. We need to prevent them from rearming, from producing more arms, and that ultimately will lead to the defeat of Germany. And so we can't divert our bombers from the bombing of Germany to bomb France. And Eisenhower said, well, if we don't do that, the invasion will very likely be a failure. And so he said to Churchill, if you don't give me the bombers, I'm out of here. I'm not going to be the commander anymore of the invasion. And Churchill agreed with him. And so the Air Force had to step down. The generals of the Air Force had to step down. And they gave Eisenhower what he wanted. And that was called the transportation plan. So weeks before, the Allied bombers completely pulverized and destroyed all of the routes of transportation in France. Now, Churchill was very worried about this because he said the French will never forgive us if we destroy large parts of the country. And he said he was concerned, so he went to de Gaulle. General de Gaulle was the leader of the French Free Army. He was in exile in London at the time, and he made radio addresses. The French Free Army had a radio station, and so the French could pick up the broadcasts. And he said in those broadcasts that there is going to be a bombing campaign, and it's a worthwhile price to pay to defeat the Nazis and to regain our freedom. And so that was certainly a big help. And so they couldn't just bomb Normandy and where the actual invasion would take place, because that would then be obvious to the Germans that that's where they were going to come. So they had to bomb all of France and all of the railway yards and railway lines and bridges and highways in France, which was quite a formidable campaign. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the deception of the Allies to make the Germans believe that the attack would be somewhere else was critical and vital and essential, because if they knew where it was, they'd be waiting for them and they would certainly defeat them. And so the Allies put a tremendous amount in these deceptive plans. They had a number of ways to do that. The first one, and probably the most significant one, was that they had double agents. There was an agent whose code name was Garbo, who posed to be a German spy and sent information to the Nazis, and he said that he had recruited agents in the major ports throughout southern England. And he was an MI5 agent, and he was feeding information that the British intelligence wanted the Nazis to believe. And they gave him good intel, and he would report that back to his handlers, and they would see that it was good intel. They would see it was accurate. So over the months, he built up his credibility, and they now really believed that he was one of their best agents in the field. And he reported to the Nazis that there was a massive troop buildup in Dover. Now, the most obvious place for the invasion would be a place called Pas-de-Calais. Pas-de-Calais from Dover was 42 kilometers. So Dover is a port in the south of England, in the southeast of England. And from Dover to Pas-de-Calais, which is the coast of France, is only 42 kilometers. The channel is a notorious body of water to cross because the weather is completely unpredictable. There are very strong tides. And so if you're sending an invasion army with the size that they did, as we mentioned, 6,000 ships across, you're obviously going to choose the easiest route and the shortest route, which would be from Dover to Pas-de-Calais. The actual route that they took were all the ports in southern England. Instead of it being Dover, it was Portsmouth and Southampton and Weymouth and Exeter and Dartmouth and Plymouth. That's where the real troop buildup was, and that's where they left from those ports. But they wanted the Nazis to believe that the real attack would come from Dover. And so which was quite logical, because the distance, for example, from Portsmouth to Cannes was 186 kilometers, much, much further. So it's 4 times further. So the Nazis would accept that it's logical, that it would be from Dover to Pas-de-Calais. And they told Garber to report back, to feed the information, that there's a huge troop buildup in Dover. And he said that I have agents on the ground in Dover, and they've all reported to me that there are a massive amount of soldiers and trucks and tanks, and there's a major military buildup around the port of Dover. So that's the first thing they did. And so he was a credible source, and the Nazis thought, okay, this is where it's going to be. They also, what the Allies did, very sneaky, is they made blow-up equipment. So just like you blow up, a kid's jumping castle, they had blow-up tanks, they had blow-up trucks, they had blow-up jeeps, and they filled the fields around Dover with all of this blow-up equipment. And so when the Germans flew over with their reconnaissance planes to take pictures, they saw these fields and fields filled with military equipment. That's not the only thing they did. Also, they set up a false radio channel in which they called it the radio communications of the 9th Army. And they all day long were saying, move these soldiers there, move these jeeps there, bring in the equipment in this place, all around Dover. So the Germans, and one more thing that the Allies did is that they put General George Patton there as well. General George Patton was one of the most formidable generals in the Allied forces. Patton was a wild man. He was a maverick. He was extremely aggressive. He actually was a military genius, as he showed a number of times in the war. And after the Italian campaign, during the Italian campaign, one of his troops got injured, and he went to see him in hospital. And this man, obviously, this young soldier was suffering from PTSD, and he said to Patton, I can't go back to the front lines, and Patton slapped him. And the Allied generals were very upset with this behavior, so they sidelined Patton, which he was completely broken and devastated about that. He wasn't part of the actual invasion. He ended up sending his troops and surrounding the Germans from southeast of France, and he was very, very successful and very important in the campaigns that followed the invasion, the taking of Normandy and then the heading towards Germany. But what they did is they used him to their benefit, because the Germans feared Patton. They thought the West was soft, the Western leaders were soft, they wouldn't be formidable soldiers. So but Patton, they knew, was the real deal. He was like built in the mold of the German generals. And they put him in Dover, and he had press conferences, and he said, I have my 9th Army here, and we're building up our force. So the Germans are seeing, Garbo says, that his agents are all reporting a huge troop buildup and equipment buildup. They see that is confirmed with the aerial photographs that they're taking with their reconnaissance planes. They're hearing all the radio messages of these armies moving around in Dover area. And Patton is there. Their best general is there. So there was a lot that was put into the deception of the Germans, and that was very critical and very important, because the Germans then wouldn't release the panzers to the Normandy area. They kept them near past the Calais, because they thought that's where the main invasion was. There was a very big point of success of the Allies. Now, the other massive challenge for Eisenhower and his generals was the weather. As I mentioned, the weather in England is always bad, and is particularly unpredictable at that time of year, because there are many storms, spring, summer storms. The Allies had good weather prediction, because the weather stations, the weather came from the northwest, and in Iceland and in Greenland they had weather stations there, the Allies, and the Germans didn't. So the Germans were not good predictors of the weather for the Channel coast, and the Allies were. There was an individual who was the most respected meteorologist in all of the United Kingdom. His name was Captain James Stagg, and in fact they're making a movie about him, I believe. I think it's called Pressure or something, a movie that's coming out soon. That's about Stagg and about Eisenhower and about this massive challenge of deciding when to go. And Stagg expected and thought that they planned the invasion for the 4th of June. Stagg, on the 3rd of June, had a meeting with Eisenhower and all the top generals in Eisenhower's headquarters in Portsmouth. And he said on the 3rd of June that we have to delay the invasion because there's a massive storm on its way. And they all walked outside and looked in the sky. It was a clear day, no wind. They thought, what's this guy talking about? But Eisenhower had worked since he arrived in with Stagg, and he trusted him, and he knew that he was an excellent meteorologist. And Eisenhower said, if Captain Stagg says so, we will need to then delay. Eisenhower says that he called a meeting of the general staff for the next morning, 24 hours later, which the invasion was due to be at 6:30 in the morning. So this was now 6:30 in the morning of 4th of June, which was the day that they originally had selected. And he said he's never in his life seen such a massive storm. He said his headquarters in Portsmouth, the building was shaking from the wind. If they had gone, they would have drowned. The Germans wouldn't have to fire a shot, and all the ships going across would have sunk. So he was very grateful that he listened to Stagg. And they weren't sure now what to do. Stagg comes in with his presentation on now the 4th of June, and he says, according to my predictions and my weather charts, the storm is going to continue today and tomorrow, but there will be a temporary respite on the morning of the 6th of June. It won't be calm weather and conditions, but it will have settled sufficiently for the troops to land on the beaches. That's Stagg's view, and that's his recommendation to Eisenhower. And now Eisenhower had to make a decision. Would he go with Stagg and trust him and plan the invasion for the 6th of June, or would he postpone it? Now, if they postponed it, there were only 1 or 2 days per month where the conditions were acceptable for the landings, because as I mentioned, they had to be in low tide because there were so many obstacles in the sea for high tide, and the tides had to be low enough for them to be able to land. And there was only 1 or 2 days a month which that would be the case. So Eisenhower had to make this calculation, either to go with it, even though it's the weather conditions are not ideal, or to delay. Now, if he delays, he would have to delay at least 3 weeks until the weather conditions would be suitable again. And he knew that the longer he delays, the more chance there was of the Germans discovering where their true troops build-ups were, where the true invasion was going to be. And they were not in the Dover area, but all in the other ports that I mentioned earlier, the southeast and south center of the British coast, and they maybe they would be discovered. And also in that time, all the troops were locked up into their camps. There was no communication. They even stopped diplomatic communication from embassies to their mother countries, because they wanted to be completely secret, Now, Eisenhower knew that that secret would eventually get out, because we're dealing with 3 million troops and a tremendous amount of equipment and all the logistics that goes with it. So he has to decide, am I going to risk that the true build-up is elsewhere and therefore the invasion will be elsewhere, or am I going to risk the weather? So the history books all say that Eisenhower said he needs a bit of time to think about it, and in that meeting he paused for 5 minutes and he thought about it, and then he responded. But in the interview, Eisenhower says that he thought for 45 seconds, about 45 seconds to a minute, and he thought about the risks involved both ways, and he said, it's a go. And so the soldiers, a lot of them were already on the landing craft, and he said, the invasion will be 6th of June. And so everybody went, and off they go. And what an incredible operation it was. Now, they were extremely worried, the Allied generals, that the original landings, the first waves, would be obliterated and mowed down by the Germans. So firstly, the paratroopers. There were 23,000 paratroopers that dropped behind enemy lines, and they were supposed to disrupt the reinforcements that were coming, as well as the big guns that were trained on the beaches. They were supposed to try and from behind take out those big guns, so they wouldn't have huge artillery fired at the soldiers coming on the beaches. So they expected, the experts in the Allied army expected that 7 out of 10 of those paratroopers would be killed. 70% of the paratroopers landing behind enemy lines. Can you imagine such a thing? They're sending these young boys. Eisenhower went to the airfield where the paratroopers were around Portsmouth, and he saw them off, and that's very famous. He spoke to some of them, and the pictures of him talking to a particular paratrooper, and they asked him, he was quite animated and moving his hands. So afterwards they asked him, the press, like, what was he doing? And he said, I saw a soldier, and I said, where are you from, soldier? He says, I'm from Missouri. And Eisenhower said, I go fly fishing in Missouri. And the soldier said that I'm also a fly fisher, and they were comparing how they throw the rod. So they asked Eisenhower, why were you doing all that? He said, I just wanted the troops to be calm. I wanted to see that I was relaxed, and I wanted to relax them. So that's why I spoke about regular things and showed them that I was a normal guy. But they say, so they were expecting, he's standing in that airfield, and he's looking at those beautiful young boys, and he expects 7 out of 10 to be killed. Imagine what's going through his mind. And they say, the reporters say, when those planes took off with the paratroopers, Eisenhower was there, and he was watching the planes take off, and the tears were streaming down his face. So such was the unbelievable fear and concern. Now, when it came to the troops landing on the beaches, Churchill writes in his memoirs that they were expecting around about 150,000 were planned to land on the day on D-Day. They expected at least 20,000 would be killed, which was about 12.5%, 13% they thought would be killed. But thank God, Baruch Hashem, the landings were a phenomenal success, and the numbers were much lower in terms of the casualties. Now, what the plan was they would send in a massive air bombardment, and they would hit all the fortifications on the coastline. And that was planned first, and then the naval guns from the big ships would fire also on the fortification on the coastline. And I've seen interviews of veterans who were on those ships, soldiers who landed on the beaches. They said, we saw the planes going over. We saw the guns being fired from the ships. And we thought that nobody can stand up to that firepower. We're going to walk across those beaches like it's a picnic. But unfortunately, that was all very ineffective, because there was a big cloud bank, and most of the bombs from the planes missed their targets. In those days, the Second World War, they were very inaccurate. They had a lead bomber, and he would drop his bomb, and then where the planes behind him saw the smoke, they would all drop their bombs on the same place. But very few of those bombs hit their targets, and also the naval bombardment was not accurate either. So unfortunately, the German defenses were still in place, and they were able to defend themselves quite significantly. There were 5 beaches, as we all know, the famous 5 beaches. There were Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha, Utah. And the casualty rate, thank God, was not as nearly as high as they expected. Overall, 5,000 soldiers were killed, Allied soldiers were killed in D-Day, much less than the 20,000 that they were expecting. And likewise with the paratroopers, the rate of attrition was much lower than they expected, Baruch Hashem. Paratroopers were very successful at blocking the reinforcements and at attacking the guns. You may have seen Band of Brothers, which is the best miniseries ever made. Used to be the most successful miniseries in the history of TV before Game of Thrones came along. Band of Brothers was made by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, and it's an unbelievable description of what's called Easy Company, which was a company in the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army, and it takes you from training all the way to the end of the war with Easy Company. And really their story is the story of the American Army in World War II. It's based on a book by Stephen E. Ambrose. He's one of the most respected historians of World War II. I recommend the book, and I recommend the miniseries. It's absolutely brilliant. It gives you a real sense of what these soldiers went through. And as we saw in Band of Brothers, they were very successful taking out the Easy Company, a place called Brecourt Manor, where there were guns that were being fired on Utah Beach. They successfully disabled those guns. And many of the paratroopers did likewise and were very successful. And so let me just take you very briefly through the numbers. In Sword Beach, which was the British Army, 630 British soldiers were killed. In Juno Beach, which was Canadian, 63 soldiers were killed. In Gold, which was British, 413 soldiers were killed. In Omaha, which was American, 2,500. So Omaha was the worst. You might have seen Saving Private Ryan, which is the best World War II movie made by Spielberg, and those opening scenes of the carnage on the beaches, that's Omaha Beach. And you got a sense of how those first waves were just mowed down by the Germans. Utah Beach, only 193 were killed. Utah, it's an amazing story. They had planned to land the largest force in a particular place, but they misnavigated, and they ended up much further down, a few hundred meters down where they had intended to land. And the place they intended to land was very well fortified, and there would have been many more casualties. And by hashgacha, by the hand of Hashem, they ended up landing in a place where there was not well fortified, and that's why the numbers on Utah were much lower. And so the landing is a tremendous success. They're able to create those bridgeheads and get 150,000 soldiers on the beach on that day, 6th of June, 1944. And it was still a big battle and a big struggle, the battle for Normandy, to get out of Normandy and to push the Germans back. Took a huge effort from the Allied armies and a massive amount of soldiers and equipment. But because those D-Day landings were a success, in less than a year, the Germans were defeated, and it brought an end to World War II in the European theater. And so, as I mentioned, it's important it's a fascinating history because of the scale of this incredible operation and the lessons we learn from it. That we have to stop the crazy madmen before they get power. And secondly, we have to have great appreciation to those that carried out this courageous operation and those that were involved in saving the free world, both back then and in our world today. Thank you for watching. And please God, we should learn the lessons of history and not be doomed to have them repeated in our world.